we will launch into things. So thank you for coming, and thank you again to Charles Alexander. I just want to publicly thank you for doing all this work to make the recording work for us, which is really nice because then we get to keep these. And thanks also to Jean Hoving and Ray Armentrout, who have been really helping this series by giving us their experience from their series, the Enclave series, which is a Sunday afternoon series, fantastic series. I'm sure if you Google it, you could come up with it. And that's every Sunday at 4 p.m. East Coast time. Okay, I'm going to close the chat room, but I'll open it up again as soon as we're done, and then we can all unmute ourselves and carry on with the discussion. Hope if you've got time, you'll stay for that discussion. They've been really nice the last couple of weeks, and I've been surprised at how fluid and smooth and fun they've been. So please feel free to stay for that. I'm going to turn it over to Bernie Quetchenbach, who is going to be today's introducer and maitre d'. Okay.
Maitre d'. I have no experience in being a maitre d'. Anyway, I did want to say a couple words about the Poetics for the More Than Human World anthology, and I've already said a couple words just by saying the title. But as most of you know, it started as a Dispatches special issue, edited by Sarah Nolan, Mary Newell, and myself, and is now in the process of becoming, we hope with some surprises added in, print anthology from Spuyten Duyvil Press. And we did look for material that decentered from the human experience, and we wanted work that really took that more than human world seriously as both a matter of approach, form, and content. And so anyway, welcome to the reading series. And our first reader, I'll just read the names, right? So our first reader for today is Kristin Prevallet.
Hey everybody, yes, thank you so much, Cole, for all of this organizing of this wonderful space, getting everybody together. Really appreciate that, and everybody else. So I'm gonna try something a little fancy for my 7 minutes, but I think it'll work. I'm gonna read the poem from the anthology, and I'm gonna share a screen that will have a video really kind of just running in the background of the poem. If you have Zoom fatigue, feel free to just close your eyes. There's nothing, oh, hey, okay. Nothing that you need to see necessarily. Sorry, my screen just flipped out there. And I talk on this thing in order to, because the sound is better. Everybody can hear me? Okay. So I'm going to begin with a dedication. I dedicate this reading and all my words, that they will drop like blood through this screen, through the floor of this room, through the foundation of this house, to seep into the earth, where these words will filter dirt through the roots of trees that have been grounded here for hundreds of years. May these roots take my words and cleanse them of the wounds inflicted by my ancestors on the people of this native land, the Iroquois, who sat in this very spot, listening to stories, sharing poems, and offering those stories to the greater good and to ancestral memory. May my words not inflict harm on any person. May my stories be understood as contributing to the greater good and to ancestral memory. Can someone give me a thumbs up that you can see this video? Okay. Old human, new consciousness. 1.1. Is a small land the sea? Is a spill oil? Is growing a fixed condition? Is toxic frolicking dump? Is birds breathing oblivious? Is shade trees? Is canopy light green? Is vines twist skinny? Is daylight still in bed? 1.2. Around the foliage, to empty. Between is matter. Beneath the forest. If a tree fell, as the shadow standing still, across the path of the sun, of the move, across the ground.
Well, I'm
In
listening to the
clearing.
poetry right now, so you can just.
I'm listening to the poetry right now, I guess.
It's the first reader. First reader.
Would everyone please mute themselves?
Pushed out of sap interior, chlorophyll unlike a leaf, cold, soon learns to fall, pushed out, a crude awakening, takes monstrous delight, obliterate, memory of the earth as it used to be. 1.4. Trees, bony arms, strike claws at the air, eyes, campers and forest walkers, pounce the call of owls, swallow small resting creatures. Night activates the heart, rises the interior of bark, lies in the crevice that shaped it, walks hesitantly at first until no longer embryo. 1.5. A symmetry of shelters, upright, tree-tiered trunk to worship, patterns in foliage, every leaf, branches and arc, the gods even here, stand firm, make bird sounds, communicate with what has fallen. 2.7. What center were we trying to hold? Out of thin air, an impossible flood, momentarily safe, earth side, then slid away, then saw drowning, not lungs, but liquid breathing. Beam fell, landscape lost sound layers, waves just as dangerous, born from the sludge, grew up not rooted to the ground. Made tracks, marked forest, 2.9, entered thought, prepared the landing, trees covered with soot, relished obliteration, with the trees, all other life faded away. Small reflections of lily pads, 2.10, a cosmic lake, a place in memory, stepped from stone to stone, journey to make tracks in 4 directions, location, many rooms, many rooms, many rooms, all simultaneous. Thank you.
And just quickly, the automatic mute when entering function doesn't seem to be working today. So if everyone who's not reading his or her work could make sure that you're muted. Thank you very much.
Our next reader is Vincente Lopez Abad. And is he here? Yes. Okay.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, so, well, I usually publish with the pen name Marcus Neroy, and you can read about me and my bio in anthology. So I'll cut to the chase and start reading a couple of poems in the anthology and a couple of others that I published elsewhere. First one is called Prometheus, WPN 114 Feld. So he scrambled uphill, found a crooked specimen to perforate, but the coring tool got stuck, fastened fast to its thick side. There were long-distance calls. Complaints were forwarded to appropriate instances. Prim specialists examined the claim. Following due order, somewhere along the line, and this back and forth, permission was handed down, and the Pinus longiva was felled. 5,000 years after its first shoot, soared in search for this blessed light, which still escapes us. Yeah, this one was called The Idiot, but there's already a novel with that title. Second one is called Chelonians. It's about turtles. I love turtles. So when I was a kid, we used to have turtles. They would disappear sometimes to never come back. One day we found a cemetery under the washer where our turtles dragged themselves to writhe under the rumble, huddling together with the spin, reptile mouths open, shell pressed against the tiles, hearts thumping cold blood. I hear them beckoning. And this one is a little bit more playful and fun. If you like Winnie the Pooh, was a great fan of Winnie the Pooh when I was a kid. Not exactly an infantile poem. Not on the existence of heffalops. It hurts me in the raw, it really does, to learn you pored over Winnie the Pooh for weeks to write a semester paper on capitalism and mass media. Christopher's an anarcho-socialist, and even Socks, Rabbit, intellectual amid so much fluff, Gopher tunneling our collective unconscious, the failed writer in Eeyore, the profligacy of Tigger, the charlatan owl, Kangas hoarding, Bruce frailty, and what about Piggy's restraint, his failed homosexuality, or Pooh's tame leadership, stealing honey from worker bees, fraternizing with ouzels? It doesn't break my heart. That's not it. It stabs and sinks deeper, hurts me in the raw of the savage love I have for humanity to think you could have spent that time, I don't know, say, singing in the shower, doing charity, tending a garden, writing a poem, falling for someone, cooking salmon, speaking with strangers, jumping off a waterfall. Anything would do, really, anything at all. Singing a garden, doing someone, tending a poem, writing for charity, falling in the shower, cooking strangers, speaking with salmon, and then leaping up the waterfall yourself, effortlessly. Damasked evolutionary miracle, flapping towards a promise of X and hope, but what would I know? Whoever saw Heffalump speak. Yeah. And the last poem is a little bit more cryptic, but it's fun. It's fun. I think you will enjoy it. It's called All Things Considered, and I'll perhaps share the link later so you can see how it's formatted. Considering man and his world made hereof in despair, that blind clockwork of daylight, its fooled moon in spousal, the truss of seasons that lend support to this emptiness we call time, the shit populating our guts, looming in translation, the plagiarism of faces, abjection, ages, things nondescript, steeped in our imagined languages, considering their amorousness, how a language, a nation, a straitjacket can soothe, how a book can crack open an almond, how an idea can play dead for centuries, how we strangle whom we love, how we die after a wise tooth extraction, considering dispassionately the aftermath of a nuclear bomb observed from a Japanese mountaintop on a hiking trip, the minutiae of baking decorations, the controversy of power output versus forward velocity in bird flight, the invention of love, the impossibility of writing about love, unheeded, Petrarchan, hackneyed, the construction of gender mobs, particle accelerators, the aesthetics of resistance, chaotic enumeration, Whitman, Darío, Neruda, Vallejo, considering the accretion of figments, the blah, blah that would bore both pastures and cows if they could only understand the possibility that a Wisconsin pasture may feel it is being ruminated upon, that art and pastures and cows have ways of knowing and feeling that we do not. Considering as pure matter of fact the uses of contingency, an aunt woken up at 6 a.m. by her nephew and child to assemble the Playmobil Western Fort, a blonde 20-year-old serving macadamia nut ice cream on a beach stand, a Mormon tween showing his father's 9mm brownie to his host brothers, a young man pulling his back out lifting a chaise longue, a young woman fainting while she drives to work, a young man relapsing, burning heroin with his college girlfriend on a steel spoon, a young man informed he has lung cancer. Broccoli is a bookhead. A young woman informed she has brain cancer. Pecans are flowers. A young man found dead from an overdose in his Las Vegas apartment. All fruits are ripened ovaries. Why children love anything that glows in the dark, and books of 1,000 questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next reader, Joan Baranow.
Thank you, Cole and Mary and everyone else who's made this anthology and reading series possible. I'm going to read 3 poems written during this shelter-in-place time period. And the first one sort of references what you start to notice when you're home a lot. It's called Infection. The hibiscus has a brown rash only an expert can explain. It's been like this for weeks. Likewise, the rose with its rust. We do what we can with what we've got, which isn't much. A spray might dissolve the stain. A pruning might let new leaves unfurl from the meristems. We can hope. We can attend to the life we let in, knowing little about their care. We, as in I, the amateur. And this poem was written in the wake of George Floyd's murder on the day that the SpaceX launched, which was a truly surreal moment. And it's called Across the Barrier. 6 days of protests in weather calm enough to launch a rocket. It lifts from its own fire through a few clouds, the camera in someone's hands unsteady, following the flame as it passes maximum pressure into a deeper blue. While down here, gravity keeps its grip on rocks and rubber bullets, ensures the shattered glass, the arc of another shot. Blood streams down, not up, pools like spent fuel in the streets. The people are trying to speak, but words go only so far, and raised hands are hard to see through tear gas and smoke. Yet there, a brief hand clasp across the barrier, caught by a cell phone, brief as a synapse, then lost among the frayed nerves, where gravity holds a man crawling to the curb, while up there, released from Earth, those others float like impossible swans in self-protective suits. And the last poem I'm going to read is called Prayer. Tonight, a full moon lights the ridge across the valley where a cloud hovers. The houses are dark at this late hour. The outraged have gone home to sleep, their placards laid by the door. Let them sleep. Let the grieving leave off their tears for a brief space. Let the news that breaks lie silent. Let the guilty get a sleep's reprieve. Let the judges and the mobs rest together. Let the moth forego the flame, the wound let go its pain. Let the quiet hours pass without a stir while earth repairs. Let dawn lean over us like a mother reluctant to disturb who must lay a gentle hand upon us. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next reader is Jeffrey Yang.
Hello, can everyone hear me? I think, yeah, great. Thanks to Cole and all the editors, especially Mary Newell for her invitation to be a part of this great book. I'm kind of over-zoomed with work meetings and such, and so I'm just gonna read one poem, if that's okay. And it's written for Kamal Brathwaite, who passed away in February, as all of you probably know, the great Barbadian poet. And yeah, so it's called Choral for Kamal. We grow upon our dead and flourish. The pain that swims into the polyp's eye, my yellow pain, grain of sand, sees memory, sees the limestone garden, 10,000 eyes hidden beneath the surface of the mere blue water. I dive through the liquid syllables to the bones of the island. Hear the flowering ocean's tongue, the amorous answering chorus of sound, living reef dub in Son, in Ottawa, in Calypso, limbo sum of sun, indwelling force of spirit, between body and soul, in Nam. Colony breeds colony, contingent chirality, temperature needs of each body inside another body, sunlight depths, tidal patience, plastid moons illuminate the endosymbiont genome, clades within clades, methylating silence, light and dark reactions, photosynthate energy, transfer budding clusters of dreaming planula, drift and settle home, choral happiness. You've left us now, no death, Loa, at the crossroads, Legba, thunderstone, Negas, it is not. Dawn after words bloom with us in us, for I to untie the nets from the belly of the whale. Thanks.
Thank you. Next reader is Catherine Carter.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you who have put this together and come to join it. I'm going to read you two poems, both from my most recent book. It is called Larvae of the Nearest Stars, came out in October. The first one is longer, sorry about that. It is called After the Colony Collapse. I'm a backyard beekeeper in a small way, and all beekeepers probably have seen the colony collapse disorder. So what happens is that all the workers, foragers, guards, and so forth get up and leave. And they leave the queen and her attendants, half a dozen bees who hang out with her. And when I saw this for the first time, I thought, I'm looking at The Wanderer, the Anglo-Saxon poem about exile. And so at that point, much later really, I took the risk of trying to write in the voice of the bee. And so I am reading this because of the question about voice on the email earlier today. The tiered square-cornered towers are bone cold, barren of the bustle and thrum of its people, Our humming palace stands hollow and still. Where are the women gathered together to comb the children, balancing burnished orange pollen pressed into panniers, fanning nectar of frost aster and blackberry bloom into strong sweets for winter warmth? Far flown, exiles and refugees on the endless roads of the sky, to sink at last, lost and confused. How quickly they fled the floors of wax and wood. How quiet now the queen kneels, that peacegiver who breathed grace and comfort up through the colony's stacked stories. Soon she'll be shut in a broad black earth chest, and though in her glory she gave life and life and life, slave to the hive, raised up the gleaming ranks and soft cells of ivory larvae, no air in her amber chamber waits to wake and mate, not one daughter. We 6 who stayed with her, creep or crawl our few aimless inches, dazed with misfortune, too dismayed even to strike at the shocked keeper, and we were once brave battle maids in August's weapon weather, fearless foragers, tender foster mothers. Who will remember now the rotating cluster, its seats at the feast, or the dance in the dim entry, summoning sisters to glean the sourwood gold of summer, bear it bright to 6-sided cups and warm combs that throbbed with song? Griefs grow countless as white clover as we whisper the name sense of nurslings and sisters. If this world's foundation is not all waste, how shall we know? Where shall the last of legions, left solitary, find grace for herself or her queen? Keeper, do even you know what brought our bright rooms to ruin and slips us into the sleep of the sting? What pillaged the pillared honey halls and made mad our strong sisters, leaving only the drumming of the north wind's needles on the steel ceiling that shields silent halls haunted by hive beetles? It is true, after all, what the old told us, that at last all happiness flows cold. All this world's stores of sweetness are fleeting and brief. And as you can see, I felt I had to explore some Anglo-Saxon devices to get my wanderer theme going there, although the chief impulse was perhaps the desire to pun on the word foundation. The second poem is much shorter, you will be delighted to know, and also much more cheerful. And this is the one that was in the, will be in the ECOPOETICS anthology. And this is a broadside of the poem, which the artist Sarah Method designed and letterpress printed to give us kind of a visual there. The poem is based on the fact that mice sometimes eat Luna moths. I hope the moths die first. I wouldn't like to swear that they always do, but they leave the wings, so you can find the wings in the summertime. A mouse has gnawed the dead Luna moth, leaving only the veined celadon sails made to cross the black lakes of these few nights, devoured sailor and ship and the pale shores of evening, and even the crescent spring green sickle, so that tonight, if you meet that mouse, you'll know which mouse it was, the one whose silver ears trim and turn to catch the May wind, the one who shines like the moon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have one more reader. And before we move to Jonathan, I just want to thank Cole again for organizing and to remind you that we have discussion right after, right? So Jonathan Skinner is our last reader today.
Hello, everyone. How do I sound? You hear me? Okay, great. Just wanted to thank Mary, Bernie, Cole, and the other readers. This is a great space. I really enjoyed the reading so far. And the discussions, especially afterwards, have been interesting. So if you can stick around, I recommend it. The piece I'm going to read is I think it's occasioned by having grown up in the desert and then living in England for a while. And I really got to the point where I started to crave forests, crave trees, like viscerally. And so I started exploring, getting into the local woodlands, and discovered this thing called Shinrin-yoku, which is a practice of forest bathing. It's very popular in Japan right now. The other occasion for this piece is the current destruction of the ancient woodlands in the UK, occasioned by the building of the high-speed rail line called HS2, which is this massive infrastructure project that's going to take 20 years to build, and claims it will be carbon neutral in 120 years. It's insane. Anyways, it's going through local woodlands, and it's been quite moving to witness the activism, the encampments that have sprung up in the woodlands, populated by families, people of all stripes, the resistance. There are people who've never been activists before, standing in the way of diggers, chaining themselves to fences, speaking in public for the first time. There have been tree sitters. The Extinction Rebellion people got involved, and the sort of professional activists have come in and tree sat, and there have been pretty amazing confrontations. Really, I think if you know Richard Powers's book, The Overstory, it's sort of that's the closest picture to what's happening right now, just a few miles from here. So those two occasions, I ended up writing this piece called, the first one was called How to Take a Forest Bath. And sort of thinking of it it was a kind of a leaflet that could be handed out, to people who visit the forest. And I dropped them off at the camps and spoken with the activists. So here we go. I'll read it. And the other part is there are slides I'm going to show. I've been taking portraits of trees over the years, and I've gone through my files over the past 10 years and started pulling out these portraits I've discovered with panorama mode. I can try to take a vertical portrait of the tree. So I'm going to screen share these as I read, and it's going to go a little bit over 7 minutes, just because I guess it's okay because we lost a reader. And where do I do? Okay, here we go. So share screen. Do you see? Let's see. Okay, let me go. How's that? Do you see?
No, we can't.
You can't see the pictures? Okay.
When you
Let me get them. Let me just do them. That was full. If I did, that was full screen. So I'll just do a slideshow. I'll just do basic.
Are you hitting the second screen share in the lower right when you get?
Okay. Let's see. I have share screen. Yeah, I've got it.
And then you'll see everything that's out.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, now let me just do this. Let's see. How is that? Do you see the tree?
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Okay, here we go. So this is now titled Paragraphs on Forest Bathing, Shinrin-yoku. If you live near an old forest or even a bit of ancient woodland, you are in luck. But if not, you can still enjoy forest bathing. Find a small stand of trees in a park, one large tree, or the shade in your backyard. Forest bathing is immersive, but no need to travel to the Amazon or redwoods or a national park. Every forest, grove, or roadside tree exceeds the space of your mind and heart. Scale and open yourself to the forest, whatever its size. If you have just one tree to bathe with, lie down, place your head between its roots, and look up. Those branches are a forest. We rarely experience trees. They surround us, silenced, the furniture of our days. Perhaps we move too quickly. In forest bathing, we slow down to meet the growth. Forest bathing begins with acknowledgement. The forest has an outside, and we go to the forest to lose ourselves on the inside. It is easy to cross a forest today without noticing. Observe the forest as you approach. Pause at the threshold to notice the forest edge. Close your eyes a moment and listen. Announcing yourself silently, await the forest's invitation. At the forest edge, a contrast between light and dark blinds your senses. Notice this transition. When you have adjusted, recall the other side. How long did you walk to find this tree with more branches than you can count? How far away is hot pavement with no shade, barren winter, desert or open sea, the overlit surface of the moon? You carry two forests inside of you, one inside each of your lungs. All life breathes with the lungs of the forest, and it is through breathing that you make contact with the forest. Without breath, there is no forest bathing. Breathe naturally and attentively, noticing your breath as it bathes in the many breathings of the forest, finding its rhythm amidst the movement of branches and leaves. Life is too short to know all there is to know about trees, but forest bathing does not require forest knowledge. While tree study may develop your perception, and while you greet the forest sense by sense, as you relax more deeply into the forest, you do not need to know the names. It is with the heart that you will perceive the trees. You can't bicycle through a forest, except perhaps very slowly. Try walking more slowly than you ever thought possible. But don't force things. Just notice how many steps for every breath you take. The first thing to ask is not what tree is this, but how do I feel? As you move more deeply into the forest, you experience the forest through your feelings, even as the forest helps you forget them. Most trees like to be touched. You don't need to hug the beech, the ash, or redwood, as if you could. Place your hand on the bark and let its fingers interlace yours. If it is smooth, touch the bark the way you might touch a lover's skin. Is it warm? Cool? Don't expect to feel a heart beating. Just share some time with the tree. If you can lay your head where the trunk goes into the ground, look up through the branches and leaves into the forest canopy. Focus on the topmost leaf that you can see, then relax and gaze to take in all the leaves. Let your eyes swim in all the moving spaces between the branches. Can you feel the light and shade on your skin? You might hear sounds from beyond the forest edge, a church bell, shouting, a football match, parent calling child, farm machinery, a dog barking. Focus on one sound, then relax to take in all the sounds, including the voices of the leaves. Listen as every leaf twists its dial on the air, making forest airs. Let the forest airs play on your sense of smell, even just the tang of a few aspen leaves, the breath of one tree. What you find by plunging your nose into warm ponderosa scales might surprise you. Others won't let you in so close. The scent of the flowering lime must be shared from afar. In New England forests, look for wintergreen, small leaves whose crunch is the definition of spearmint. It can't hurt to take just a bit of the woods between your teeth, to taste plants with the tip of your tongue. Low creeping brambles present tangy fruit, free from farmer's spray or territorial canine pee. If you see a mushroom, bring it to your nose. It's okay to break a bit off. The mushroom's just the fruit of the mycelial tree. As spores release on low creeping mists, shaken loose by your footfall, can you tell the edible apricot of chanterelles from the sickening honey of jack-o'-lantern, acrid poison of the amanita from the sweet bread of puffball, lactaria's bitter milk from chicken of the woods or earthy bolete? Don't let browsing distract from bathing. You're just eating off the branch, not filling a basket. Take off your shoes and let the earth between your toes, feeling its temperature, the tickle of leaves on the forest floor. It won't be long before you notice you're not alone in the forest. In forest bathing, one experiences birdsong as forest airs. Leave binoculars, field recorder, and camera at home. You probably won't see birds anyways, just a fleck of color, a commotion in the leaves, unending flits between branch roots. You might feel their shadows on your closed eyelids, or shadows of leaves in the canopy. Their bewitching song sounds a quiet forest, as a choir opens its spaces, or embroiders the surf of wind and leaves with half-heard notes. The monody of night-singing birds, indistinguishable from trilling frogs, can still the most agitated heart. In the forest, birds take wing as trees take leaves. That bird could be a squirrel extending the arc of a branch, a buck startling at your scent, the distant bark of a fox, the floss of a porcupine's snack landing on your head, one thing become another. The forest won't leave you alone. There might be mosquitoes or biting flies, nettles, thorns, and poison ivy. Spiders are more likely to bite in your home, but ticks are a real concern. If you forest bathe in tick country in early spring, you need to protect yourself. Don't mess around with the tick. Educate yourself. Learn the symptoms, but don't get paranoid. If it's rained, the forest floor could be heaving with slugs. You might wince at the crunch of a snail shell underfoot. There are a lot of prickly, gross things in the forest, but humans could be the grossest. We are taught to leave no trace. Forest bathing might mean a shit in the woods. Be prepared and take time to do it right. Enjoy the moment. Forest bathing is not about getting clean. It is good to bathe alone, but in communal forest bathing, individual pleasures wash away into something that is more than the ease of each participant. As you move together through the forest, don't be surprised to find yourselves communicating without words. Those voices you hear are the thoughts of the trees. That's it.
Thank you.
Let me unshare. Oops. How do I unshare? Stop share. There we go. Okay.
Great. So everybody feel free to unmute yourself and add chat notes if you want, and share your opinions, your questions, chance to talk to the people who've just read to you, find out more about their backgrounds or their interests or their work. I'm going to start out just asking you, Jonathan, about the images, which are striking and just go so well with. There's something about the pace of the images and the pace of the work, and I just have the most banal question: where are the trees? How great a geographic range are they taken in many continents or?
Well, I started photographing them here. I think I got my first iPhone I got here, and the panorama function was vastly improved on that. And then, the forest in England are, like the forest that's being destroyed that I mentioned is probably, we know it's at least 1,000 years old. It's mentioned in the Domesday book, probably much older. But what's old is the soil and the roots. Forests have been managed for centuries in England. And so they leave what they call standards, and then there are coppice trees. So the standards grow large. So there are these very singular large trees, which you also find at the edges of fields. And they have such personality. They grow in hedgerows. I mean, they're real individuals. It's like running into General Sherman in the countryside or something. So I just felt like I wanted to take portraits. So a lot of them started around here, but then in travels across North America with my partner, Catherine, and around Europe too, I've taken a lot of portraits. Some of them are urban trees. I think there's a tree in Paris. There was the Bruegel in the museum, in Brussels. Trees in the Rocky Mountains. Trees in the Pacific Northwest. There are a few trees from Vancouver Island and the Hoh rainforest. Those astonishing moss draped trees which are on the Olympic Peninsula. Rocky Mountains in New Mexico. Redwood forest in Northern California. New England. Trees. I have a lot of tree pictures.
Just to follow up sort of on that question a little bit, I was wondering about the relationship between the specific images in your text and whether, as you put together the presentation, there was sort of a plan to pair some of the specific stanzas with the specific images.
Totally random. I only found I could do the screen sharing. I put it off asking Cole to the last minute, and she kindly said yes. So I just dumped a bunch of pictures in a folder, and they're pretty random. Yeah, it would be interesting to think about, curating the relationships. So.
I just wanted to say that I thought they worked really well together. Like I thought it almost seemed like you carefully planned it.
That's how the randomness works, I think. I thought better to be random.
Illusion of form.
More natural that way, right?
Nice. Nice.
I was struck that Kristin began with the roots of trees, and then Vincent, right, his Pinus, his first poem was a pine tree poem, I think. That was a sort of theme. That was also accidental.
I wondered if people are getting a lot of writing done in this time. I'm having trouble. So it was interesting that at least one of the readers today read recent material. I just wondered overall how people are doing with their writing practice.
What practice?
I've been writing more than I ever have before, partly because my poetry group made a challenge for each other to write every day. If I didn't have that expectation, I don't think I would be. So, because I'm like an obedient good girl. So like if someone wants me to do something, I do it. And so it's been really helpful.
I have to work on my online courses for fall, so it's totally derailed my creativity, unfortunately.
Yeah, I get that. I get it.
I'm somewhat in the same boat. I've also been distracted by working on online courses, but
can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
A little better, yeah.
Okay. I've also been distracted by working on online courses, but I have been trying, I reach a point where I just can't, my brain can't focus on that, and that's when I write.
When I was listening to Jeffrey, I couldn't help but remember Kamal Brathwaite readings, which invoke sort of so much more than the present in his voice, in his constant tapping of rhythms, in the ocean rhythms. And that's when I started thinking from then on through Jonathan's as this reading particularly, and I could go back to Kristin's and others too, having a certain sense of ecopoesis as a spiritual practice. And I guess I sometimes think of it as a scientific practice, as a poetic practice, but there seemed to be a lot of spirit today. And I wonder if any other readers could talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that, particularly in this sort of theme that emerged of the tree and the spiritual connections between trees, among trees, other species in trees. If anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
It's amazing how there's a huge tree behind you, Cole.
I was It's a California live oak, estimated between 250 and 300 years old.
Wonderful.
Nice.
I'm bathing in it.
I guess I would just say that, when I started doing poetics, I used to get all these emails from people like, I just saw this bird. Can you tell me what it is? Or, what is that tree? And as if I was an expert. And for me, it began from a place of unknowing. And the reason I wanted to write, quote unquote, nature poetry was to learn some things. So there has been that kind of research dimension, but I'm really hapless with trees. My first book was about cacti, and I could deal with cacti, but still horrible at identifying trees. But increasingly, I've found that the spiritual, taps into the relational. For me, ecopoetics is really about the relational. So, that's why there's that sort of thing about it's not about forest bathing isn't about tree knowledge. It's about, it is about the sort of relational. So. I don't know if, it's one needs to be metaphysical or transcendent, but I think ecopoetics for me has always been about relation between poems, between, differences between species.
And maybe even the opposite of transcendent, an imminent kind of connection that seems to kind of break down the species, a shared, there's a way I think of shared consciousness we have with particular.
And a place of unknowing. I mean, to me, that's important, really, and that's sort of the practice of I think Thoreau called it beautiful ignorance.
Yeah, I could respond to Charles's comment as well with that. I mean, thanks for that. I mean, Kamau, I was able to see him read. I don't know, I probably knew him for maybe just 15 or, well, I mean, that's a long time too, but 15 or so years, but I saw him read a number of times and heard him on recordings and things. And just speaking about his work, which was so connected to place and to finding a language for that place, Barbados, and then beyond that through kind of Middle Passage and all the things he wrote about. I don't know, for him it was always, for his work, it was always so connected to the spirit of a place, and even language for him was alive. I mean, I guess it is for all of us, but I mean, he even dedicated the book to his typeface, you know. So he had a very spiritual sense of poetry, a very kind of tangible feeling about it. And so yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And then just how spirit right now. I mean, these days we're thinking so much about breath again, and breath with I can't breathe and breathing and breath, and that linguistically is connected directly to spirit as well. And so that I think comes out and yeah, a lot of work into trees breathing. So
could you say something, Jeffrey, about resistance? I mean, about Kamau's activism, you know, because he just is so, to me, that's such a powerful aspect of his work, is that, you know, situation of his land at the end of the airport runway or next to it, and, you know, how he kind of held that position.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about the details of all that. I know that he was involved with because yeah, I can't even say exactly what was going on, but I know a lot of the land is his ancestral land, and where he lived there was kind of being encroached upon by government and I think private ownership issues. I think Tom Raworth was very involved, or trying to help him involved at some point, trying to get more public kind of consciousness of that, what was going on there. I mean, he spent many years in New York teaching at NYU, and so he's back and forth as well. And then early on, of course, in his life, he was so involved with and continuing on for when he moved permanently back to Barbados with the local and a kind of island community of writers, and he was involved a lot, very involved in the playwriting theater there on the island. And you know, I mean, I always would, you know, I talked to his press people, the People Tree Press, and meeting writers, they were all saying how involved he was with encouraging people. I mean, this is just hearing from other people what he was involved with, trying to cultivate this kind of literature coming from there, because growing up he didn't really find that growing up, from what I could tell that he was talking about. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
I've been sitting with this thought for a while, and Kristin's poem at the beginning, I've held a line with it through the rest of this reading, which was, what center were we trying to hold? And I think I've been wondering, as this series has been going on over the past few weeks, as we consider the more than human world, which seems in some way to be predetermined by an understanding of what is human, I'm wondering what the poets or the editors conceive as being the threshold that we must pass across in order to identify poetics as being the more than human. Like, what is it that separates it from the human? And is there is there a specific definition or understanding that we might have of the human that makes it possible for us to conceive and write into something that is beyond human? What is the relational aspect that Jonathan was speaking of ecopoetics, of the more than to the human, if you will?
Well, on the more than human, the first thing I thought is that it's inclusive of the human. The human is in it and everything else is too. But that implies that there are relationships that are going on beyond the human. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about, Jonathan, your forest thing is that those trees are all sort of talking to each other too, and to the other animals that are involved in them. And we are part of that conversation, but we are not that conversation. I mean, we're not the whole thing. We're not even central to it, really, right?
I wonder if the more than human also doesn't have something to do with a recognition of species consciousness, that we are Homo sapiens, and that Homo sapiens are a vile and destructive species who are really responsible for the elimination of beautiful, gorgeous, gigantic flying creatures and dinosaurs in all sorts of amazing shapes, and that just this constant sort of way of coming into kind of a herd-like response to whatever outside or other thing that we feel like needs to be, commandeered. And I know I'm using the word we in a species way, which I understand is already a very fraught conversation to be had. But it just seems to me that if the more than human is an invitation to be less Homo sapien and actually try to evolve as a different kind of species, and that the ecopoetic project, in terms of just the understanding of language's viral relationship to colonization and to a sort of language as a weapon of the species of Homo sapiens, and that the ecopoetics, I feel like, is perhaps an attempt to think about language in a way that is not colonizing of every single thing that it touches. That not everything needs to be corralled into some kind of an experience, or into some kind of an epiphany, or into some kind of a colonized space. So that's just kind of free falling thinking about what my association to the more than human could possibly mean.
I would add there that we have the kind of narrative of Homo sapiens as an inherently vile species is still part of the narrative that we are in some way different from other species. And I do not think that is so. Actually, the thing that makes us most like other species is our tendency to use things up until they are gone and to destroy the habitat we have. The deer will browse the habitat down until the boom and bust cycle lays them low. The bunny rabbits will do it. Just about anybody will do it. And conceivably, our coronavirus is part of the cycle. Virtually none of us, human or otherwise, are prone to kind of make the best use of our resources and restrain ourselves voluntarily until predation or famine or disease does its in. It makes me feel very connected, actually.
Yeah, I think it's more about decentering the human and doing that through art in any means possible. And also, nature is an insect that goes about its way, but it's also a swarm of locusts. So there is a lot of destruction in nature too, and it's totally natural. So I coincide with you, Catherine. So, we sometimes forget that.
I think temporalities are interesting, as far as decentering ourselves, replacing humans in a larger than human space. involves a lot of scale shift, including temporal scale shifts. And one thing that's so amazing about Richard Powers' novel is it's this attempt to sort of what would narrative look like from the temporal perspective of trees that live, hundreds of years, and do we even appear, in that sort of in those segmentations of perception that if trees perceive, are we going so quickly that they don't even see us? Think of a tree. I think one of the problem with my portraits might be that it kind of individualizes and disconnects what is essentially a network. That a tree is right behind Cole, right behind you, Cole. That's just like a world right there, of teeming with creatures and relations, and of different temporalities. So for me, poetry, and ecopoetics is currently for me of interest in is a kind of time engineering, or ways that we can slow down and speed up and open up time within language to become more perceptive of different scales.
I liked your comment, Vincente, very much about using art to decenter the human, and the idea of a human activity being used to decenter the human, and just making me think of art as always starting within the human, but always going outward, and always at the frontier of what is human, stretching that frontier, but also always exceeding it as well. So thanks for mentioning that.
I like the way bathing in the forest tends to become, and I think maybe this is through the act of breathing that was in there, becomes bathing with the forest. And that's putting species on kind of even footing or something.
Problem is, though, it's not even, and that's why I asked the footing is not even, the playing field is not level. That's why I asked the question about resistance, and I think what's interesting about the spiritual is, as I've witnessed these demos and the young, passionate forest defenders and tree sisters who are chaining themselves to fences, quite scary situations, being, pried away with power tools. They're singing, and they're singing beautiful spiritual songs.
I just want to say too, I think it's a little bit in the background, but it's it is this incredible thing to bathe in the forest and to breathe in the forest and to have that relationship of the extension of the human into the forest is such a beautiful thing. One of the things that was happening in the video that I showed was actually, that was a video of the Hudson River, in which are floating scores of dead fish going up the Hudson River, because the Hudson River flows in two directions. The dead fish had come from the ocean, where the waters are incredibly, I suppose, warm and therefore contributing to a lack of oxygen. Those fish, then just scores and scores of them floating by the waterfront of the Hudson River, where I happen to live. And that's another kind of bathing, isn't it? Another kind of bathing in the wafting smell of certain kinds of ecosystems as they quite literally die and decay. So just wanted to sort of think about that as well, that there is a way of bathing in that there's this, sort of taking in the uncomfortableness and the discomfort, as well as the profundity and the beauty, and sort of really challenging that, not as an experience. All experiences should be there's interrelation to these. It's not one is better at anything like that. It's just an interesting thing to bring up from the background of that video, which I don't think was obviously made very clear.
I'm glad you mentioned. I was going to ask you about the video, and also question I had further down the road is just interacting with this format. It seemed like you were kind of taking up the format as a medium in a way that, I've been hoping presenters would. I would just add, I mean, about that mingling versus opposition. I mean, I think that sort of permeable, dissolving into mingling mode is one that we've been acculturated to. But really, for me, that, you know, the polarity, you know, and that's when I invoked those moments of resistance. But they're connected.
I'm trying to find a poem by Jose Hierro about whales in Long Island, but I can't in English. But I'll try to find the translation. It's really good. But there's something always uneasy, right? When fish are floating in the sea, right? It's particularly, yeah. There's a lot of recreation and sailing in Madison, in the Monona and the Mendota Lake, but they're extremely dirty. So it's both, yeah, it's quite, I don't know. I've fallen into the lake, and it's not an easy experience. So yeah, it's funny to see people having fun while fish are floating around. Yeah.
That weird way that we're actually literally bathing in the death that we're causing.
Yeah.
I didn't see the image clearly enough in the video. It would be really interesting to see if a close-up would get the visual impact of that, because it would be extremely striking.
Yeah, and again, ecopoetics can have that kind of political use, right, of raising consciousness and awareness of the ecological disaster that's already happening, right? But I guess for me, it's just another component. Like we've talked about spirituality, right, and mourning, and yeah.
Kristin, I guess I'll ask you, can you say a little, I heard what you said about the fish, but can you say a little bit more about how the video relates to the piece you read? Or can you
what did Rachel say before she left in regards to Jonathan's images of disjointed form or something like that? She had a great phrase for that idea of you just kind of put things together and see where it all falls in the reader's mind. It was just kind of 3 videos that I had, and I just thought, I'm going to put these 3 together and think about them in terms of this poem, which is just about this, which is just this. I don't even. It's just a familiarization of all these different terms locating the human in time and space. So I just thought, the first one is of my neighbor, who I just thought was just incredible. His hand gestures while he was behind this mask. There's a choreography there. I really want to explore that more. It's amazing watching people talk in their masks with their hand gestures, as if that is somehow making a difference in terms of not being able to see their mouth, And then the last part was just this little performance piece that I did right as New York started to open. So like 3 weeks ago, that feeling of like, wait a minute, I'm still in this kind of weird cocoon thing. I'm not ready to come out yet. I'm going to go lie in the fire pit and make a performance piece, So it was all disjointed. It was just all imagery, language, just kind of coming together to see kind of where it all fell.
Were you thinking about the Zoom format? Because I was struck that you begin by speaking to the telephone, into an old school, hardline telephone.
Yeah, no, I do think about the Zoom format in terms of like this new way of doing a poetry reading,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Zoom fatigue is real, so I feel bad sometimes about showing video or sometimes I'll just have audio going in the background of a reading as opposed to trying to show video. But just trying to figure out this new form that we are all now in, and how does the poem come through this form, this new environment, very different than a bar, but at the same time we have this international capacity now to be able to really talk to each other across oceans and borders in ways that are really exciting. So
you're picking up on the choreography of speech now. It strikes me as that's another, like the Zoom form is a new form, but the gestural and choreographic form that we've all been thrown into because our big indicator face is just completely, and the metaphor, the visible metaphor of muteness, of being muted by this thing, I think is extremely strong. And for me, your video really brought that out, that there was the blackness of the mask, the redness of the shirt, the greenness of the background, all really emphasized the muteness. And then at the same time, it is being supported by this wonderful poetry. So there's a really strong tension that I found really successful.
I think the first one of these events I attended, wasn't there someone, there was a bird went off in the background, and then later someone said, you forgot to mute your bird.
All right.
Moments.
I love seeing the combination of the poetry with the visuals, and it's like Zoom makes it so easy. The technology has evolved so that you don't have to be a filmmaker to create, these beautiful sort of hybrid forms of art. So I really appreciated seeing the slideshows and videos along with.
There's also this kind of trickster element to it, and sometimes the Zoom will freeze our faces and we're, you never know exactly what's going on there either, this big X factors.
There's something so interesting about it as well, like going to video, readings live and seeing a video prompt behind feels so significantly different to the full immersion that we might get through a video reading. For example, like right now I can change my background, so I'm sat in Burnley. I think it seemed like I was going to do that. Is it doing it? But like that, the possibility to do that feels like so profound, like that we can situate ourselves in a different place to what we already are in a much more immersive way than we might otherwise do. I don't know.
Yeah.
I have a question, kind of turning the page a little bit, but going back really to this idea of the ancestral memory and the trees, and drawing on a couple things that were said throughout other people's different readers today. I was looking a lot at that spatial relational aspect and kind of carving out space in the ecopoetical kind of framework. And I was wondering if you could each speak a little bit more to that. Jonathan, with when you said you read "The Forest Has an Outside," and then you went on a little bit more about how we go in, we immerse ourselves to kind of find the forest within. I would wonder, I'm very curious about if you could talk a little bit about that spatial relational aspect for you and the breadth. And also, maybe perhaps in relation to what Kristin said about many rooms all simultaneous. I really love that line, and it also reminded me of Zoom, amongst other things, but the marked forest and between matter. That was really important for me, the between matter. And then again, it came up with other readers, Catherine's discussion of the colony collapse, and Joan's for a brief space. All these things very much related to for me. And I wonder if you could, any of you, comment more about that in your work.
Well, there's one little stanza that I cut because I didn't want to take up too much time, but it said, when you exit the forest, turn at the threshold to hear the sounds you have behind, asking the forest permission to go, and say your goodbye. Feel the coolness of the forest and the warmth that awaits on the outside. Remember the forest when you have left. At home, cozy in your bed, think of the nocturnal life. So for me, experience has always been very important, but both in the sense of like, experiential, but experiment also. The ground truth, what some eco-critics call ground truthing. But what's interesting is that there's such a sort of emphasis on immediacy or a presumption of immediacy, whereas I think what's really powerful is the mediate, and that, that we are actually mediating. But, when you really tune into what I call vibrational communication, you tune into the mediate, to the fact that everybody is a medium. We are all mediums for something else. So really, what I feel I need to attune to is not so much the immediate moment, this present moment, but the memory and remembering, when I'm not in the forest, remembering the forest, and maybe when I'm in the forest, remembering that there's an edge to the forest and an outside. And sound can help, because sound travels. We don't have sound. We don't have earlids, also. So it talks to our unconscious when we sleep. We can't shut our ears the way we shut our eyes.
Well, I think Jonathan's poem in the instructional mode, it makes it ever present. Like, remember, do this. The speaking directly to the listener or the reader makes the poem always present. I don't know how else to explain that, but.
Do you all happen to know Stanley Kunitz's poems about the hornworm? There is the hornworm, the summer reverie, and then there's the hornworm, autumn lamentation. And they are perfectly delightful poems. And one of the moves he makes there, I'm very partial to. He takes the risk of taking on the voice of the hornworm, and he writes himself into it at the end. The hornworm is covered with the eggs of a parasitic wasp, which are going to eat it alive, and the hornworm will be paralyzed and eaten non-vital parts first, bit by bit. These things that gave Darwin a bit of worry. And so he turns around the hornworm and he says, "You with the red snippers," and it's Kunitz, right? He's about to cut the hornworm in half and put it out of its misery. And he says, "You with the red snippers, before you do this, which of us knows the ways of the great worm in the sky?" So that was kind of what I had in mind when I had my bee turn around and ask me what was going on, because of course we don't know either.
I ask you, Catherine, I was really interested in the mingling of the Wanderer poem and the bee colony. And I just would love to hear you talk more about your choice to kind of put those together. Bees are such wanderers with such a purpose to their wandering, which seems nicely contradictory. And
I think for the bees, the hive is like the mead hall. It is the place of darkness and solace and warmth and community. They are, they're these social insects. They are absolutely mysterious. It is remarkable how they do it, why they do it. How the hell do you evolve from a bunch of solitary queens, each feeding your own young, into a bunch of sexually relatively sterile workers, all working to preserve the hive? It is bonkers. And the hive is the place of community, and the foragers go out, but they come back. And the mead hall for your Anglo-Saxons, very much the same thing. They were living in a somewhat inimical world where nature was a kind of fearsome thing to contemplate. Outside, you've got Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon and death and all that great stuff, which is not so great when you're looking at eye to eye. And for the bees also, without your social relationship, it is absolutely anathema to everything we know about social insects that the bees should get up and depart. And so I thought, that's what it must be like for the queen and her attendants. Everyone's gone and everything has changed.
It seems like that incredibly hierarchical structure of the queen, the attendant, and the seems so medieval in itself. I was just really enjoying that echo.
Well, actually, the hierarchical structure is a function of our language, that we call it the queen. The medievals thought it was a king, and Gower and a number of other poets also used this to talk about the ways that a kingdom should be organized. They used the beehive as a model of a good kingdom because everyone knew, quote unquote, his place. They didn't know they were female. And everyone did his task without being told to do it. But that's just us. I mean, the queen, she's not a queen. She is the slave to the hive. She spends her life in endless reproduction. The attendants are there to keep her there as much as to serve her. And she is necessary to the life of the hive. I mean, all that queen, worker, attendant stuff, that's just the way we have constructed it. You know, how the bees see it, God only knows. You know, for Anglo-Saxon, it was easy enough to kind of stick with that, but it's a real problematic way to consider it.
A colleague of mine published a really interesting paper about infidelity in mice. And I'll look for it and maybe email it later. And he did a really interesting investigation and basically figured out that mice could detect infidelity in their long life couples, and they would scold each other, you know, when they detected this infidelity that happened. And yeah, and I mean, people had to study this in order to construct a reasonable story, right? I mean, after all, yeah.
Yes.
Natural law is totally incomprehensible unless we tell a story about it, which might or might not be true.
It might or might not. And it is, you know, we've seen over and over again that the stories we construct tend to have big old holes right in the middle of them. You all probably remember Meerkat Manor, and it took them like 8 seasons to figure out that, you know, there was not a king, there was a matriarch. Yeah. Also, the bees kind of hate me, so I always hoped I would be one of these bee whisperers, but I'm the other thing, you know. They see me coming and they rise up and issue death threats.
I just wanted to thank Jeffrey for reading that beautiful elegy for Kamau. You know, because I just, you know, I feel really strongly that climate change has already happened for a lot of people on the planet, and those are the people we need to be hearing from more and more.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot to think about with ecopoetics. Is such a huge word, you know. Like, I mean, I've been reading a lot of. I don't know if people have read Ed Ricketts. He wrote that book Between Pacific Tides, and I studied a lot of marine biology in college, and he is kind of the one who wrote still read today and a lot. The first real comprehensive study of the intertidal zone along the Pacific, mostly, and organizing the book by habitat rather than like taxonomy, and you know, and so he's talking about a lot about the wholeness of the environment and the interrelation between things, which is like in the 1930s. But then when you go back, I mean, I've been discovering, like, when you go back even farther, like, people have been talking about this, and you go back another 100 years and that idea is already there. It's just that we can't like internalize it or something. I don't know what it is. Like, and then right now you're just seeing, you know, everything. I mean, it's just seeing the problem with the human species. I mean, brought this up before, is that it's just the effect, the kind of overall effect is so destructive. I mean, and so, you know, Jonathan was talking about like ideas of resistance and things, and you could see it everywhere. Like the groups of people in Indonesia and the forest there, and in China, the environmental movement has been super strong for many years now. But it's just always I mean, it's again this same kind of like story of the people, or a, you know, very small percentage of people empowered, or maybe not even just that the government, like the need for government regulations and all these things, until you're seeing these things that we already know, but then need to be acted upon by all kind of strata of society and government, and seeing, I mean, it just gets, it's just like the most frustrating thing, not to say that, every individual has the answers to these things, but when you see like what's happening now, I mean, we've read the reports and stuff, and just how to those points of resistance. I'm not sure what that means, right now for that, because it's, but I think it's important to always be acting on that and thinking about that as well.
I love what Catherine said about. Oh, sorry. Oh no, I was just going to say. I love
that's okay. I was just going to say, just to we're having broadband problems, but I just wanted to interject a little tiny bit of hope, in that this reading is happening in the same week that both the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Pipeline were halted. Yeah. And that came from hard work for many years by many people. It needs to be monitored. But Jeffrey, I was wondering, this was my first experience of your work, and I found it really interesting and wonderful, of course, the homage. But I also wondered, maybe it's partly your t-shirt, but halfway through the poem, I felt a real biologist mind in there. And I just wondered a little bit if you have a real either diverse background or a real, marine biologist connection.
Oh, yeah. Can I ask who's speaking? I'm sorry. It's just so weird.
It is. Sorry, it's Evelyn Riley. There's so many of us.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a background in sciences just through college, and I've always been interested in. I worked for a bit at Scripps during college, and went on a couple of research cruises and things like that. And so I've always been in love with the coast there and the ocean. And I'm always fascinated with scientific language in poetry, things. But
yeah, you use it really wonderfully. It's very noticeable. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I think Kristin had something to say too. I was curious to hear what.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I was just saying about what Jeffrey was saying earlier, and what Catherine was saying about the bees. And it just brings to mind that conversation about eusociality, the way that bees and wasps have this way of being in collaboration, non-producing species, not producing children, but just basically benefiting to the benefit of the larger society, versus the survival of the fittest. And I don't know, it just really feels like that, that I want to be on the side of the eusocial movement, which I feel like ecopoetics is a eusocial movement. Does that make sense?
They're not really totally contradictory. For it to have worked out evolutionarily, cooperation must have been extraordinarily adaptive. Otherwise, we would have no social insects. But yeah, and that too is a case of what story do we tell? People often interpret survival of the fittest to mean, let me stab the guy next to me. And that is adaptive under some circumstances, but clearly in terms of surviving as a species on the planet, it's not very adaptive now.
I think part of the, the resistance of that sociality is also linguistic diversity. One thing, Brathwaite, I think it's Brathwaite, has that wonderful notion of tidalectics, right? Which is a sort of movement of dialects between the islands of the Caribbean, moving with the tides. And so that's like something more specific and more useful, I think, than ecopoetics. It's actually, sort of geographically situated, and it invokes and convenes multiple languages and dialects. And really, I learned when I studied permaculture with indigenous people in northern New Mexico that, plants depend on human language for survival. That when the name of a plant is forgotten, that plant becomes even more threatened than it is already. So there's this intimate connection between linguistic diversity and biodiversity. And so then I'm thinking of the monolingualism of this reading. It was so wonderful to hear Vincente, some Spanish in your reading, at one moment. But that's a real problem, I mean, I love English, but it's, scientific language is one. I love science because it kind of foreignizes English for me, but it also is colonizing and problematic. But just to throw that out there.
Well, just to add on to, randomly almost add on to what Jonathan said, language can be thought of as an evolving, and I think of it as an evolving, almost an organism. There's the old Burroughs quote, of course, language is a virus from outer space. I wouldn't go that far, but I mean, definitely language is you have to think of language as a living organism. I mean, how can you write poetry if you don't? That's my view. That's kind of a digression.
I can't remember the poet who defined this, but he defined poetry as the self-consciousness of language. I think it was La muerte sin fin de Gorostiza. I think Gorostiza said this.
Oh, well, that's a
consciousness of language.
Great poem. Great poet. I love that poem of his about the glass of water. Did you write a poem about a glass of water? It's a famous metaphysical poem.
Probably. I haven't read that one.
Yeah.
Would you mention the name again of the poet?
Gorostiza. La muerte sin fin. I think it's by Gorostiza, but give me a second. Yes, Jose Gorostiza. I can send you a copy. Quite interesting poet. He wrote this poem and then fell silent for years and years.
Yes, if you would put it in the chat so we can find it.
I guess just to complete that thought, I feel like, well, how can we make space for other languages as users of the mono language? That I know one poet, Robert Kochik, who believes that English is actually needs to be kind of actively destroyed because it's like a monocrop I don't feel quite so hostile to my own language that way, but
well, and every metaphor at some point has this moment at which it kind of breaks down, and I'm not sure that language does work really just like a crop.
Right. Yeah. Monoculture, maybe not.
Yeah. Grass lawns.
Lots of pesticides.
Come on.
But I love English. I mean, it has so many great words for trees, for example.
Yeah, but English's large vocabulary in part comes from colonialism. I mean, the colonial history of England and the United States. So there's that too.
Maybe this note on language and its monoculture is a good moment to say goodbye and to say thank you very much for coming. And please do join us next week at the same time. For the people who are reading next week are Kara Chamberlain, Bradley J. Fest, Petra Cuppers, Andrew Melrose, Elena Rivera, Arthur Z., and Jen Webb.
Thanks for listening, everyone. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, so many new faces, people I love. Hi.
Yeah, thanks you all. It was a wonderful reading and discussion.
And see you all next week.